Sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is that you are no longer needed, no longer part of the family you once thought you belonged to. In the quiet of the morning, the house is still, the kitchen lights flickering softly as the hum of the refrigerator breaks the silence. There is an unspoken tension in the air, a quiet chill that fills the empty spaces where once laughter and chatter thrived. The table, perfectly set, but the seats are mismatched now, one at the head, another at the end, a subtle but undeniable distance between them. She moves around the room with precision, but there's an edge to her movements now, the same way a servant might hurry to clean up after a meal that no one noticed. Her hands tremble slightly as she sets the plates down, ensuring everything is placed just right, yet no one acknowledges her efforts. It's a routine she has performed for years, but now, it feels like a performance she's no longer invited to. The family gathers, but no one makes eye contact with her. It's as if she's become part of the background, a ghost in her own home. The hum of the television fills the silence as they sit, engrossed in their own world, oblivious to the woman who once sat at the center of it all, who now stands at the periphery, unnoticed. She catches a glimpse of her reflection in the window, her face tired, eyes heavy with the weight of years of giving, of fading into the background. It wasn't always like this. She remembers a time when her presence meant something more, when her voice was heard, when the family was something she could rely on, a place of warmth, of belonging. But as time passed, the seat at the table grew smaller, and her space in the family shrank, the walls closing in around her until she was no longer a participant but an observer, left to watch as others took over what was once hers. The subtle dismissals began to pile up, moments when her opinions were ignored, when her contributions were overlooked, when she was excluded from decisions that affected the family. A glance here, a raised eyebrow there, the gentle push aside that made her question her place. She thought it was just a phase, that things would return to normal, that she was just being overly sensitive. But now, standing in this room, she knows the truth. She's been replaced. She's no longer a part of this. The realization settles into her bones like ice. She looks around at the familiar faces, but there is no recognition in their eyes, no warmth, no acknowledgement. They are a family, and she is the outsider. She can feel the weight of the years, the countless moments she has given without receiving, the sacrifices made without a single word of gratitude. And now, she sees the truth in the way they speak over her, in the way they turn their backs when she needs them the most. It's as though she has disappeared from the narrative, and they've moved on, leaving her behind, as if she was never a part of their story to begin with. She stands there for a moment, frozen, before she turns and walks away from the table, her feet heavy with the weight of realization. The room behind her is filled with their laughter, their voices growing louder as she retreats into the shadows of the house. Her body aches with the quiet sorrow of being pushed aside, of being replaced, but there is something else beneath the surface, a spark of something new, something she hasn't felt in a long time. It's a quiet determination, a flicker of resolve. She knows now that she must find her way back into the story, not by asking for permission, but by taking control of her own narrative. She is no longer the invisible woman behind the scenes. The truth has been revealed, and she will no longer be a passive participant in her own life. The morning light spills gently through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. The smell of freshly brewed coffee hangs in the air, but no one speaks. She moves silently around the room, placing mugs on the table with the careful precision of someone who's long forgotten what it feels like to be noticed. The clink of ceramic is the loudest sound in the room, yet no one acknowledges her. The family gathers, as they always do, but the space between them feels wider now. Her husband sits at the head of the table, absorbed in his phone, barely glancing up as she sets his coffee in front of him. The children, now grown, exchange pleasantries with their father, their voices light and carefree, but there is no place for her in their conversation. She takes a seat, but not at the table's center. It's a small detail, yet it stings. She's pushed to the side, her seat further down the line, just far enough to feel the distance that's grown between them. They speak over her, their words not directed at her but to each other, as though she's an afterthought. She forces a smile, but it doesn't reach her eyes. The conversation moves on, effortlessly flowing around her, leaving her alone in her silence. She looks at the table, at the empty spaces where once there had been laughter and shared moments. But now, it feels more like a waiting room. Her chair is too far from theirs, her presence too small. She glances over at her husband, but his attention is elsewhere, his gaze fixed on something outside the window. She knows this is the moment when everything changed, when she stopped being seen, when her place at the table was no longer hers to claim. She watches as the conversation turns, a new topic introduced, and once again, she's left out. Her voice, though present, is never heard. She's been relegated to the periphery of their lives, and it's as if no one notices. No one sees how she's quietly fading away. She adjusts her posture, trying to fit into the space she's been given, but it's too small, too distant. Her presence no longer commands attention. It barely registers as a background hum. The others continue, oblivious to her, their laughter ringing louder as she sits there, still, in the quiet space they've made for her. She wants to speak, to call out, but the words feel stuck in her throat. They'd only glance up, a momentary recognition, before turning away again, as though nothing had happened, as though she were still a part of this family, still in the center of their world. But she knows better. She feels the coldness of her own silence and the weight of a family that no longer needs her, no longer sees her. And in that moment, she realizes that the mask she's worn for so long, the one that's kept her in place, is starting to crack. It's no longer enough to keep pretending, to keep smiling through the gaps that have grown between them. She's not a part of this anymore, not in the way she once was. The space at the table has been taken by someone else, and she is left to watch as the life she once had slips quietly away, one unacknowledged moment at a time. She remembers the warmth of the kitchen years ago, the way the morning light used to dance across the countertops, casting playful shadows on the walls. There was a time when her place in this house felt solid, like the foundation of a home that would never crack. She would stand by the stove, stirring a pot of soup, while the laughter of her children and the casual chatter of her husband filled the air. There was a comfort in the routine, a rhythm she had come to depend on, and she was always at the center of it. The family would gather for meals, and she would sit beside her husband, feeling the connection, the shared bond. But then there were the moments that slipped by unnoticed, tiny shifts that, at the time, seemed insignificant. A glance from her husband, quick and dismissive, as he turned his attention to the children, his eyes no longer lingering on her with the same warmth. The way her son, once so eager to tell her about his day, now spoke to his father first, his words almost floating past her as though she were no longer the one he sought. It was subtle at first, these small signs that something had begun to change. She would laugh it off, telling herself it was just a phase, just the natural evolution of a family. But even as she tried to ignore it, the feeling of being edged out began to creep in. She remembered the day when they gathered for the family photo, the one where everyone stood together, smiling for the camera. Her place was still there, right beside her husband, but the way they positioned themselves made her feel smaller, as if she were just one piece of the puzzle, no longer its central part. As the photographer clicked the shutter, she caught a glimpse of the way her son looked at her, not with the affection he once had, but with a kind of polite distance, as though he were unsure of where she fit in the picture anymore. The memory lingers like a faint echo. It's not the big things, she tells herself, but the small things, the glances, the slight shifts in how they behave around her. And even though she tried to convince herself it was nothing, a voice inside her knew better. She began to feel it then, the invisible wall growing between them, brick by brick. Her place at the table, once a given, now felt like a concession. The family was still there, still moving forward, but she was no longer the one they leaned on, the one they turned to. The absence wasn't loud or obvious. It was a quiet, almost unnoticeable thing. The space she occupied was shrinking, and the distance between her and the one she loved was expanding. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that things would return to normal, that the rhythm would find its way back. But even as she stirred the soup that day, even as she smiled and pretended everything was fine, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something she couldn't fix. The walls of the house, once filled with the sound of her laughter, were starting to echo with silence. Her silence. And she knew, in the deepest part of her, that something inside had already begun to break. The dinner table was set once again, the familiar clink of silverware a soft backdrop to the tension in the room. She placed the salad in front of her husband, but this time, something was different. Her hands were steady, but her mind wandered back to a memory that had quietly surfaced, one she had chosen to ignore for too long. It was the anniversary of their wedding, a special occasion that had once been marked with joy and togetherness. She had spent the entire day preparing the meal, just as she always did, but this time, the air felt heavier. As the family gathered around the table, she noticed how everyone had begun to gravitate towards each other, their conversations light, their laughter easy. Her daughter-in-law, who had once looked up to her with admiration, now sat at the center, effortlessly engaging with everyone. She was laughing, her voice bright and clear, her presence commanding the attention of the room. It was as if the space that had once been hers had been claimed by someone else. She tried to join in, to share a story, but her words were drowned out, as if no one had even heard her. Her husband, seated beside her, didn't even glance her way when she spoke. He was too absorbed in the conversation with their son and daughter-in-law, their voices merging into a chorus of familiarity, leaving her as an outsider. A small detail caught her eye. The chair beside her, once a place of importance, was now slightly further from the table. It was as if they had moved it back without a word, a subtle shift that left her feeling small, irrelevant. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural flow of things, but deep down, she could feel the weight of the change. The evening wore on, and as the dessert was served, her daughter-in-law turned to her husband with a smile, asking for his opinion on a decision she had made. It was a simple question, but the way it was asked, the way her husband responded with such eagerness, made her stomach twist. She had once been the one who made those decisions, the one whose thoughts were sought after, but now, she was nothing more than a passive participant. She tried to smile, to play along, but the bitterness that had begun to seep into her heart made it hard to pretend. She watched as her family enjoyed the evening, the conversation flowing seamlessly without her, and she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of being replaced. They didn't need her anymore. She was no longer the cornerstone of their lives, no longer the one they turned to for guidance or warmth. The family was still there, but she had been pushed aside, quietly excluded without a single word being said. She finished her meal in silence, her movements slow and deliberate as she cleared the table. No one offered to help. It was as if she were invisible, her presence not even enough to warrant a simple gesture of consideration. And in that moment, as she washed the dishes alone, the reality of what had been happening over the years settled in. She had been slowly erased, replaced by someone younger, someone who had taken her place at the center of the family. She looked out the window, watching the fading light of the day, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. She was no longer needed. She was no longer seen. But instead of confronting it, she chose to swallow the truth, to bury it deep down where no one could see. Even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind, revealing the quiet betrayal she had refused to acknowledge until now. The house felt different now. The sound of the door creaking open used to bring a sense of warmth, a familiarity that made it feel like home. Now, it was just a reminder of the distance between them, a distance that had only grown with time. She stood in the doorway, watching her family move about, but it felt like she was no longer a part of their world. Her son, once eager to share every little thing with her, now barely acknowledged her presence. Her daughter-in-law, once a daughter to her, now held the reins of the family with an ease that made her feel invisible. It wasn't just the small details anymore, the seat at the table or the conversations that bypassed her. It was the quiet erosion of her role in the family, a role she had built with love and sacrifice over the years. The realization hit her when she found the will. It wasn't intentional, just a misplaced envelope on the counter, but when she opened it, she saw something that made her heart stop. There, in black and white, was the allocation of assets, her husband's decision, and her name, barely mentioned. It was as if she had been reduced to a footnote in the very life she had helped create. The house they had built together, the years they had spent, all of it had been silently claimed by others, and she was left with nothing but a sliver, a fraction of what was rightfully hers. Her mind raced, but her body remained still. She closed the envelope slowly, almost reverently, as though touching it would break something inside her. It wasn't the money, not really. It was the betrayal. The years of quiet exclusion, the subtle hints that she was no longer needed, that she was a burden rather than a partner. Her husband had made the decisions, but he had never once asked her opinion, never once considered her input. He had simply moved on, as if she were no longer relevant. The feeling of being replaced, of no longer being the center of the family, was sharper now. The house, which had once felt like her domain, now felt foreign to her, a place where she didn't belong. She could feel the weight of it every time she entered a room, every time she walked past her husband, who no longer looked up, who no longer saw her. She had been pushed aside, quietly, without confrontation, but the impact was devastating. And now, as she held the will in her hands, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. A choice had been made, and she had been excluded from it. She set the envelope down, her hands trembling, but there were no tears. There was only a deep, quiet realization. She had been replaced. No longer a partner, no longer an equal, but a shadow of what she once was. The injustice of it settled over her like a heavy fog. She was no longer needed here, and it wasn't just the will. It was the accumulation of years of being sidelined, of being made to feel that her place in this family was disposable. And in that moment, the pain of the betrayal became clear, but so did something else. She wasn't going to fight it. She wasn't going to scream or demand to be heard. She would accept it, but she would also reclaim what was hers. She would find a way to take control, not by raising her voice, but by taking a step back, by reclaiming her own life. The house, the family, it no longer defined her. She would define herself. The silence between them was no longer just the absence of words. It was the quiet acknowledgement that everything had changed. She had thought, for so long, that the cracks in the foundation were simply part of the natural wear and tear of life. But now, the weight of everything that had slowly broken was suddenly undeniable. It came in the form of a simple gesture, a choice that, at first glance, seemed harmless, but in that moment, it shattered the last remnants of denial. The family had gathered for dinner, as they did on many evenings, but this time, something was different. She stood by the kitchen counter, preparing the drinks, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the tension in the air was palpable. Her son walked in, followed by his wife, both laughing, their conversation light and carefree, completely ignoring her presence. They moved past her as if she were a stranger in her own home. Then, her husband entered, holding a folder in his hand, but instead of walking toward her, he passed her without a word, walking straight to the table, sitting at the head. He didn't even glance her way. The action was small, but the impact was profound. She had always been the one to stand by him, the one who sat at his side, yet tonight, it was as if she was no longer needed. Her place was no longer there. For a brief moment, she stood frozen, a glass in hand, staring at the space where she used to sit. The room around her seemed to shrink, the familiar walls closing in as the realization hit her with full force. She had been pushed out. She had no place here anymore. The family, once a circle she was at the heart of, had moved on without her. They no longer saw her. She didn't even belong in this moment anymore. The silence between them was loud, deafening, and for a moment, she felt the urge to speak, to demand to be seen, to make them notice her. But she said nothing. She simply stood there, watching as her husband, her son, and his wife settled into their roles, their lives, without her. No one asked for her input. No one turned to her for support. She wasn't even part of their conversation anymore. The pain she had ignored for so long suddenly became clear, sharper than ever before. It wasn't just about the small moments anymore, the empty chair, the quiet conversations. It was about the truth that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. She was no longer central to their lives. She was no longer a part of their family in the way she had always been. Her role had been erased, her place taken by someone else. The room around her was full, yet she felt the sharp sting of isolation. Her eyes were fixed on the table, on her husband who was now deeply engrossed in a conversation with their son, while she remained silent, invisible. Without a word, she placed the glass down on the counter and turned, leaving the room. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to fight for attention or recognition. She simply walked away, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty space behind her. The decision had been made, without her, and she understood now. She had been replaced. She wasn't going to fight for a place that wasn't hers anymore. She had been erased, quietly, without a confrontation, without a word. And as she walked away, a part of her felt strangely calm, as though she had finally accepted the truth that had been hiding in the background all along. She sat in the same chair by the window, the soft hum of the house around her, but everything felt distant now, like the house was no longer hers, like she was just a visitor in a space she once controlled. Her eyes lingered on the table, once the heart of family life, now a place where her presence was barely acknowledged. She had done this before, sat at this table, wiped down the same surface, but now each motion felt slower, heavier, as if the weight of everything that had shifted in the last few days had finally caught up with her. The family moved around her, a well-practiced routine, but she was no longer part of it. Her hands moved mechanically, collecting the plates, clearing the remnants of the meal no one had truly shared. The clink of the dishes was sharp in the quiet, an echo that seemed to fill the space, but no one noticed. She paused by the sink, staring at the warm water running over the dishes, the steam rising in the air. For a moment, she felt numb, like she was watching herself from afar, unable to reach the person she once was. She used to feel joy in this, in the quiet act of care, of making sure everyone had what they needed. But now, it was just a task, an empty movement, as if she were cleaning up someone else's life. Her husband's voice drifted in from the other room, low and distant, his laughter blending with their son's. They didn't need her. The realization was sharper now, more profound. She had been replaced, not just at the table, but in the family. She no longer held the central role she once did. The place she had carved for herself, built from years of effort and sacrifice, had been silently usurped. She reached for the towel, her hand brushing against the soft fabric, but it felt out of place, like the towel itself didn't belong in her hand. Her grip tightened for a second, as if she could hold on to the feeling, but it slipped away, and she let it fall to the counter. Her movements slowed even more, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. She stepped back, taking in the scene around her, the kitchen, the table, the living room beyond. The family was still there, still whole, but she no longer fit in. She was a ghost, a figure that drifted in and out, unnoticed. It wasn't anger she felt, but something far deeper, more unsettling. She wasn't angry at them. She was simply aware. Aware that everything had changed, that the family she once knew had moved on without her, leaving her behind in a life she no longer recognized. The idea of returning to what was before, to the warmth and comfort she had once felt, seemed impossible now. There was no place for her, not here, not in the role she had played. The air in the house had shifted, and so had she, but she couldn't find her way back to the person she used to be. The dishes were done, the kitchen was clean, but it was all for nothing. She wasn't needed. The family didn't see her anymore. And the truth, the final truth, settled in her chest. She had been pushed aside, replaced without a word, without a fight. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no loud moment of realization. It had all happened quietly, gradually, until the space between her and them was so wide that even she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. She stood in front of the desk, the papers neatly spread out before her, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. The house was quiet now, the familiar hum of daily life absent, and it felt as though the entire world outside these walls had faded into the background. Her hands, steady and sure, slid the documents into place, one after another, her movements deliberate, but without urgency. She wasn't rushing anymore. There was no need. She had taken her time to observe, to watch how things had unfolded, how her place had been quietly stolen from her, and how the family continued without a second glance. But now, with the papers in front of her, with the facts laid bare, there was no more uncertainty. She no longer needed to ask for permission. She no longer needed to seek approval. She had come to understand that she wasn't going to be invited back into the center of the family, not the way it once was. It was clear now. She had been replaced, and that was a reality she would have to accept. But what she could do, what she had the power to do, was shift the narrative. She didn't need to yell, didn't need to fight. The game had been played, and now it was her turn to make the move. Her gaze moved across the room, lingering on the items she had spent years caring for, the spaces she had once filled with her presence. They were hers once, and as her hand hovered over the papers, she made a decision. Not a loud one, not a visible one, but a choice that would shift the balance of power. She gathered the documents, each one a small but significant step towards reclaiming what had been taken from her. The signatures, the careful details, the things that had once been hers to decide were now hers again, but she didn't announce it. She didn't tell anyone. She simply tucked them into a folder, slid it into the drawer, and locked it away. There was no need for confrontation. The family didn't need to know yet. She wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't looking for anything anymore, except the quiet knowledge that she had regained control, that she had something in her hands that no one could take away. As she stood there, the stillness of the room wrapped around her like a cloak, the full weight of her new awareness settling into her bones. This wasn't about reclaiming her old position. It wasn't about going back to what was. It was about moving forward with a new sense of clarity, of strength. She was no longer bound by the roles they had forced her into. She would move through this house, through this family, with the quiet power of someone who had finally stopped looking for permission. She turned away from the desk, her steps calm, steady, her mind already moving towards the future. She had no need to announce her actions, no need to explain them. She would let the change speak for itself. She moved through the house with a quiet, deliberate pace, the weight of the decision heavy in her chest, but no longer unsettling. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way to the living room, where the family was gathered, laughing and talking, oblivious to the shift that had taken place. She paused by the door, watching them for a moment, her eyes lingering on her son and daughter-in-law, the same faces she had once depended on, the same voices that had filled the space with warmth. But now it was different. She was no longer part of this. She could see it clearly now. The roles had shifted, and she no longer had a place in the center of their world. The love, the connection, had faded, replaced by something that wasn't hers to control anymore. She had already made her move, already secured the things that mattered most. The papers, the decisions, the things that had once been shared with her, now firmly in her hands, locked away for her future. There was no confrontation, no demand for explanation. She had learned that what she needed wasn't their approval. It wasn't their recognition. It was her own peace, her own strength, and that was all she needed now. She stepped out of the room, her movements calm and measured. She no longer looked back, no longer sought anything from them. There was a quiet finality in the way she walked away, as if she were closing a door on a chapter that had run its course. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need their permission to reclaim her life. And in that final moment, as she walked out of the house, the weight of everything that had happened, the years of sacrifice, of being sidelined, finally lifted. She wasn't looking back. She wasn't waiting for them to call her back to the table. She had found her own space, her own purpose. The world outside was waiting, and for the first time in a long time, she felt free. She had taken back control, not through loud actions or demands, but through a quiet, deliberate decision to step away, to let go of the role that had been imposed upon her. The family would move on without her, just as they had before. But she no longer needed to be a part of their narrative. She had written her own. And with that final step, she closed the door behind her. Have you ever reached a point where you realize that sometimes leaving is the most powerful thing you can do?